Alright, welcome to section 2.4, multiplying real numbers. As usual, these examples and exercises have been pulled from the Algebra 1 textbook you see here. Let's get started. For ever since probably middle school or elementary, you've been used to problems 1 and 2, which are the basic calculations where you solve for whole numbers and you get your answer. So for 1, your answer would be 7 times 4, 28, and then minus 1 times positive 1, which is minus, so it would be a negative 28. For number 2, here let's get rid of this arrow. But for number 2, let's go ahead and do that down here. It's negative 9 times negative 10, which is equal to positive, because the negative times positive, and then 9 times 10, which would be 90. So our answer would be 90. But as you move on to high school math, you will start to see variables, as we've discussed in the first. For those of you who don't remember, a variable is any number in which you can substitute a number into a variable and get an definite answer. So for example, if you do x plus 5, I can say that x equals 2 and you'll get your answer as 7. Right, so that'd be a good example of that. But now, instead of adding and subtracting as we have been doing, we'll be starting to multiply numbers. Now, it is very similar to how you're multiplying other numbers, like the first two examples. You've already seen these and you're very familiar with these. But when you add a new variable, it does essentially the same thing as these numbers do, but instead of having a number that you're multiplying with a letter. So it'd be negative 1 times negative 1, we know is a positive 1, and then 18 times x, which would be just 18x, x. So your answer would be 18x. And we'll just do another example for because one thing I would like to go over, which will prove to be very useful later on when you start to solve some harder and more complicated problems. But for something like 6/5 x times 5, right? Now you could solve this two ways. You could solve it with method 1, 6 times 5, which would be 30x over 5, which would be 6x. Or you could do another method, which is the more efficient method, and this will prove to be very useful later on. But instead of doing the whole calculation like how I did up here, you can do an easier method where, because there's a 5 in the numerator and the denominator, you can cancel these out and you'll essentially be left with the same numbers you see here. And instead of multiplying the whole thing and dividing it by 5, you can just cancel out the 5s and you'll be left with 6x. Now this is a simple problem, so you might be thinking that, oh, well, there isn't really much difference. You could do it easy and any way. and you'd be right for that kind of problem. But in these exercises, in exercises 1, in exercise 1, it's very similar to how I just showed you. For exercise 2 and 3, you really can't do the division problem because it's multiplication. But for number 4, it's a challenge problem, and the reason I put it as a challenge problem is because I want you to solve it with the least steps possible. So in other words, I want you to solve this in as little steps as you need. So instead of for example, instead of taking 2 steps here, I just did it in 1 and got my answer. So very similar to that, I want you to solve number 4 in that kind of way. And as usual, make sure to subscribe and like our videos. Thank you.